Welcome back to the show, the Statesman Podcast, with your host, Nelson. And today, I want us to pause and take a sober look at Zimbabwe's political reality as we are going to diagnose the political state, which is Zimbabwe. And my central argument is that Zimbabwe is not simply an authoritarian state in the traditional sense, nor is it a functioning democracy, a properly functioning democracy. It exists in the shadowy middle ground, a hybrid regime that straddles competitive authoritarianism and full-blown autocracy. On paper, the country holds elections, has an opposition present in parliament, multiple media outlets, and a judiciary that appears to be independent. But beneath this whole facade lies a very different reality. Institutions that are hollowed out. There is nothing inside of them. Institutions that is no longer substance of what they are structured and that they exist to have. They no longer or they have that substance. They are tightly managed. Take, for instance, the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, which is being run from the office of the president and cabinet, and whose chief is alleged to be the most corrupt person in the country. And Zaki is supposed to be probing into the dealings of the president, his acolytes, and everywhere else within the country, but it's being run from within the president, the office of the president. ZEC, the Zimbabwe Election Commission, being run by soldiers, people from the intelligence community, and the whole system has been systematically tilted to guarantee ZANU-PF's continued dominance. So in this episode, we are going to unpack this hybrid character, and we are also going to look at the arenas where contestation still matters, and most importantly, we are also going to ask how citizens and opposition can then gradually and effectively challenge this slide towards full authoritarianism. So there is often debate about whether Zimbabwe is simply authoritarian or still has remnants sort of democracy. But I argue that Zimbabwe sits in between. It is what political scientists call competitive authoritarian state. And this means that between elections, this means that yes, elections are being held, opposition parties, they exist, and there is the outward appearance of pluralism. But when you scratch beneath the surface of all of that facade, the competition is neither free nor fair. The system is designed to guarantee ZANU-PF survival. And this happens while keeping just enough of a democratic facade to claim legitimacy. If you look at the quality of political parties that participate during the presidential election, it's very shocking, and you wonder, what are all these parties doing? But there is a purpose in their madness. It is a strategy to endorse elections and render the winner legitimate. So there have been views and arguments by people who advocated for Nelson Chamisa and before him Morgan Tsvangirai to shy away or not to participate in the election, somehow to render the election illegitimate because the main contender did not participate. But when you see a plethora of political parties which are never going to win anything in the whole country, even a council ward, they participate at the presidential level. And the main reason why they participate, they are allowed to do so just because if the main opposition who is being choked out of the system does not participate, these ones, they will legitimize the whole electoral process to say all of these parties, they participated. And as you have seen along the years, they will all come out saying, oh, the election was free, the election was fair, the election was credible. So that is the purpose why those political parties are there. But are they really to enhance democracy? No, they are not to enhance democracy. They are there to serve the regime's survival. So let's break down how Zimbabwe is an authoritarian state. So number one, let's talk about elections. And elections, I argue that they are a managed competition. Elections are the most visible marker of democracy, but in Zimbabwe they are carefully managed contests. And I'll think of 2023 in Harare and Bulawayo, which are opposition strongholds. Ballots arrived late, polling stations opened long after schedule, and voting even spilled into the second day. Observers noted that this likely suppressed voter turnout where the opposition was strongest. And on top of that, you have got forever associated Zimbabwe FARS, which is linked to state security services. They set up tables outside polling stations, allegedly recording voter names. Many saw this as intimidation in plain sight. And on election night, police, they raided independent observer groups, arresting more than 39 monitors and seizing their equipment. And now the outcome, Mnangagwa was declared the winner of the presidential election with 52.6% of the vote. But almost every credible observer, from the European Union to the Carter Center, from the Commonwealth to even SADC, pointed to glaring irregularities. So yes, elections, they do happen, but the elections tilted by design. Now, the second aspect is what happens between elections. So what we have seen along the years is the shrinking civil space in Zimbabwe. So manipulation doesn't only happen on election day. It also happens between elections. The civic space is deliberately narrowed. So an election is cycle, what you call an electoral cycle, an election cycle. We have got the pre-election period, we have the election period, and then we have got the post-election, the immediately after election period. Now, where you see political parties doing post-mortems of their performance during the just ended elections. We see even the vote counting announcement, that's immediately post. But then there is a post electoral period. For example, where we are right now, in 2025, in August 2025, where we had elections 2023, and then the next election is supposed to be conducted in 2028. This is also a stage of post-electoral cycle, part of the cycle. So what happens now is when everyone is quiet, when everyone is unaware, the democratic space gets shrinked. When everyone is unaware, you only wake up when it has already happened. And when it comes to the election period, the period around the elections, that's when you realize the impact of what would have happened during this period. So manipulation doesn't only happen on election day. Between elections, the civic space is deliberately narrowed. So take the so-called Patriotic Act, for example, which was passed in 2023. It criminalizes vaguely defined offenses like injuring the sovereignty and the national interest. In practice, it's a legal weapon against dissent, or the Private Voluntary Organizations Amendment Act, which was recently signed into law. It gives the government sweeping powers over non-governmental organizations. And then the definition of non-governmental organization, then it ceases to have any effect, because by the definition, the government should never be getting involved with the NGOs. Maybe in regulation, setting up like in their setup, the regulations which establishes them, it must be to that extent, but not to determine what they do, where they are getting money, how they are using their money, and even to have dissolution powers. The government cannot have dissolution powers with an NGO. They are non-governmental, which means by operation they are not supposed to be. The government is not supposed to be involved in their day-to-day running. So in practice, it is a legal weapon against dissent. So the very NGOs that monitor elections, they provide social services or even defend human rights, are now under direct threat. Now, this is how an authoritarian state sustains itself, by cutting off the oxygen of civil society between electoral cycles. Now, number 3, I'm going to talk about use of the law as a tool of repression. Courts are supposed to be neutral arbiters. In Zimbabwe, they are often instrumentalized to favor the ruling elite. After the 2023 elections, dozens of CCC MPs were recalled by someone claiming party authority. Courts upheld these recalls, and the court blocked many from contesting by elections, and this ended ZANU-PF an artificial majority. And then there is the case of Job Scala, who spent nearly 600 days in pre-trial detention only to receive suspended sentences. Now, the message is clear. The courts are not used to administer justice, but to punish and intimidate opposition voices. Media pluralism without diversity, point number 4. So on paper, Zimbabwe has more TV channels now, but when the licenses were handed out in 2020, they were mainly to regime-linked outlets. Speaking of ZTN, Nyanda Radio TV, which is actually being run by the military, so I hear. We have got the 3K TV. So yes, there is more than one channel in Zimbabwe, but the content is aligned with the ZANU-PF narratives. Scholars call this pluralism without diversity. Yes, there are different platforms, but the voice is just one. And then number 5, we got black lines between party state and among party state and security. So there is a gray zone where party and state merge. Forever Associated Zimbabwe is the perfect example. It is presented as a civics group, but evidence links it to intelligence structures. Now, during elections, it ran registration drives, it collected voter data, and it stationed its members at polling places. Now, this is how competitive authoritarian regimes operate. They create parastate organizations that intimidate while giving the ruling party deniability. And then the 6th one is independent assessments, which is the last one in my definition of in trying to define how authoritarian Zimbabwe is. So you had independent assessments. Don't just take my word for it to say, this guy maybe he doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, forget what I am saying. But Freedom House, it rates Zimbabwe as not free. Human Rights Watch, the Qatar Center, the EU, the Commonwealth, they all highlight serious deficits in political rights and civil liberties. And remember, even SADC itself, which usually stands by incumbents in Southern Africa, it issued an unusually critical report on the 2023 election. Remember the Mumba report. And it says that the Zimbabwean elections did not meet the regional democratic principles. However, despite the above, I will argue today that the agents, it still exists despite the authoritarian tilt. Now, political scientists like Levinsky and Way, who coined the term competitive authoritarianism, they emphasize that opposition forces, even in restricted environments, can still mount challenges in 4 arenas. The first arena is the electoral arena, which is why it's not very much advisable for the opposition to fail to participate in an election, maybe as a protest, or to try and force political reforms. It's not very much advised because the electoral arena is one of the very few spaces where opposition can still fight. So, flawed as elections they may be, they remain a battleground. Opposition can still contest. They mobilize, turn out, and expose manipulation. In Zimbabwe, Triple C's strong showing in Harare and Bulawayo in 2023 is proof that urban constituencies can resist capture. Even if outcomes are rigged, campaigns themselves create political energy and visibility. Then we have the legislative arena. The legislature of a country is the parliament, the lower house and upper house, the lower house being where MPs sit, the upper house being where the Senate sit in the case of Zimbabwe. So even in a weekend parliament, opposition MPs can delay bills, they can question ministers, they can use parliamentary privilege to publicize corruption. Now, before RICOs decimated their numbers, Triple C MPs, they did leverage on debates to highlight scandals like the gold mafia expose. Then, number 3, we have got the judicial arena, which has become very difficult in Zimbabwe because the courts have been compromised, they have been captured, actually. So litigation remains a tool, nevertheless, for buying time, and it delegitimizes flawed processes and drawing also international attention. Now, for example, opposition challenges the cause or candidate exclusions. They did challenge all of those things, and it actually drew international attention. Not only that, they may not have won, and they didn't win in most cases, but they document repression and they also keep civics issues alive. And then the 4th one, which is the last one, is the media and civics arena. So despite state capture, I argue that alternative spaces still exist. Social media platforms, thank God for social media, really. Diaspora press and church-based civics forums offer channels outside ZANU-PF control. Now, civil society, even under the PVO Act, it continues to monitor rights violations and mobilize national solidarity. It's a shame what is happening in Zimbabwe because the church was supposed to be was not supposed to participate openly in politics. What we see, but the ZANU-PF has ripped all of that. Has ripped that divide. Now you see Mapostori, all of them. Also, there's the Zion Christian Church, the ZCCCC. They are really participating in politics and in the side of ZANU-PF, supporting the party, supporting the president. And we can see Wikino Jifayo, who is sponsoring a lot of their events, funding them. Recently, bought even passes for them. So it's a shame what is happening in Zimbabwe, what the church has been reduced to. So it's a shame, I would say. But then what needs to be done going forward? So Nelson Chamisa left opposition politics. Okay, I mention him because he's probably the only credible opposition. Not only credible, not credible per se, but he is the one opposition leader with the numbers that may be required to upset ZANU-PF. So he left the Triple C, and now I think he's starting something, according to him, he's starting something new. And while that new is coming, while that new can be effective, but that is not the whole thing that we need in Zimbabwe. Because when you are fighting a regime like ZANU-PF, which has pervaded every facet of society, every state institution, which controls every state institution, what you need is an ecosystem to resist the authoritarianism. What you need is an ecosystem, and that ecosystem is not limited to a political party, but it may operate around a political party, it may mobilize around a political party, they may find common ground. They don't have to be more politicized though, but they can support the political party which shares the same values, shares the same values as the other players in the ecosystem. So for these arenas to matter, the above arenas which the media, the judicial, the legislative, blah, 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 for the arenas to matter, opposition politics cannot act in isolation. Zimbabwe needs a supportive ecosystem, and this supportive ecosystem, it includes student unions and youth movements. I had a discussion, there was a discussion on X a few days ago, and someone argued that the student unions, not all the student unions, but ZINASU, they ought to function in a manner which is aligned to, they have always functioned in a manner which was aligned to MDC, then MDCT, and now Triple C. And I posited that they don't have to be politicized. They have to stick to their issues, focus on the issues. They have to be guided by the rules of the game, because once you get politicized, you become targets, and your end and your effectiveness is very near. So when the party declines, what happens to the student union also? The student unions which are aligned to the party, they also die, which is very important, that they should always stick to the rules of the game. Yes, they can be used as incubators for leaders who are going to then be cascaded into parties which aligned, whose values are aligned to the values of those student unions and any other youth movements. But they have to stick to the rules of the game. They have to stick to issues and limit their engagement to those issues. So historically, students drove nationalist and democratic struggles, reviving campus activism, and this actually can counter apathy and authoritarian indoctrination. So apart from the students' unions, we also have worker-centered unions. The ZCTU birthed the MDC in the late 1990s, and this reinvigorated worker-based organizing. And then, which was the root of opposition in bread and butter struggles, actually. And the collapse of the economy has weakened this group, and the politicians needed to invent trade unions around the informal trade, around informal trading, which is sprouted all over Zimbabwe. And then we also have faith communities. Now, churches remain trusted platforms across the divides. They can provide moral authority and convening power against repression. And we also have independent civil society and NGOs. We have seen how the government is also invading their territory. So even under tighter regulation, they act as watchdogs. They document abuses and also sustaining global pressure. And then we have got, lastly, diaspora networks. So millions of people that are abroad, Zimbabweans, they can supply financial resources. They can also participate in digital activism. I have seen a lot of critics saying, you guys, you are keyboard warriors. You guys, you are only found on Twitter. But there is a word for it. There is a name for it. It's called digital activism. And that is it's a modern way of doing things. And you can actually mobilize even on the, even in social media spaces. And alternative narratives outside the regime's control, they can be circulated freely on social media, especially with the diaspora community. Now, so this layered ecosystem, it widens the democratic space, and it keeps authoritarianism from closing in fully to a full-blown authoritarian state. So where does this leave us? Zimbabwe is not a closed dictatorship like North Korea, but it is a competitive authoritarian state which leans heavily towards outright authoritarianism. And elections are held, but their credibility is undermined. Because they exist, but they are weaponized. Media is plural, but it's not diverse. Civic space exists, but it is shrinking very, very fast. So what does this diagnosis reveal? For me, it reveals that Zimbabwe is not yet a closed dictatorship, but it is a competitive authoritarian system which is sliding closer to outright authoritarian rule. Elections, they are held, but they are manipulated. Courts exist, but they are weaponized. The media appears plural, but it speaks with one voice. And the parastate actors blur the line between government and party. Now, yet precisely because Zimbabwe still carries fragments of democratic institutions. There are entry points arenas of contestation in the electoral field, in the legislature, into the judiciary, and media that can still be fought for. But no single party can do this alone. What Zimbabwe needs is a broad movement ecosystem, unions, student bodies, professionals, faith networks, community groups, and independent media, all of them working in tandem. So the path to democratization will not come from waiting for ZANU-PF to reform itself, but from citizens weaving together resilient networks that raise the cost of repression and expand the democratic space and slowly reclaim the institutions that have been captured. So if Zimbabwe is a hybrid state leaning toward authoritarianism, then the task before us is clear: to push back piece by piece until competition and accountability are no longer shadows, but lived realities. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time on this show, please do us a favor, subscribe, like, and share the video. Thank you guys. See you next time.